Hi, this is OOren again, representing the buyer for Team 2. And the second issue that I want to cover today is the kind of general issues around the holdback and indemnification escrow fund. So we started with a holdback. The LOI language is just customary holdbacks. So the language we started with is to have out of the purchase price that is $75 million in total, we were to hold back $5 million just for ourselves in our own account, hold back $5 million for indemnification that would be held and released for 36 months. That's how we treated it originally as the base values there. The seller came back with, excuse me, a dollar amount that is $2.5 million held back that will be paid into escrow and held in escrow. It would be held for, I believe their release date is a 12 months period from closing. So starting closing dates in 12 months for $2.5 million. And they also added this issue that the $2.5 million holdback will be um, the sole method of recovery. So the sole and exclusive source for recovery of the buyer of any indemnification shall be the indemnification escrow fund. So they're capping indemnifications effectively at $2.5 million and within 1 year. So this is a pretty major issue, I would say, probably even bigger than the earnout. To start to discuss, I'll split into a few issues, but first the escrow. So I'm not too worried about arguing for against the escrow fund. I think that's fair and could be customary as the LOI asked for, but we do need a lot of clarification on the terms of the escrow fund. I think that includes things like interest following the principal, drafting language around the disbursement of the escrow, who pays for the escrow agent. I believe that the seller should pay for it, or will at least take the position that the escrow should be paid for by the seller, uh, and because that they are requesting it, uh, whereas we would have agreed to just hold back in good faith. They're asking for an escrow, so they should pay for the escrow and any fees that are associated with that. But because most of those terms are not really in here yet, I think that would be a separate issue that we might draft in the second draft and trying to come up with buyer-friendly terms there and just say, okay, for now we agree to the escrow. And then in the second draft we come with hard buyer-friendly terms for the escrow account and go there. And then go from there for a second round of negotiation to discuss the escrow terms. But for now, we would just agree to the escrow, maybe add some language to make sure that we're not agreeing to anything too much there. Next, in the holdback, to treat the kind of dollar amount, so that 2.5 million instead of 5 million, but we have to really treat that together with the release date and the idea that it's going to be a cap on indemnification. For example, if it's a really short date and it's lower money, then there can't be a cap on indemnities, and they have also the reps and warranties only surviving until the release date. That survival period will need to be longer. If there is a cap, then we need to have, if we do agree to a cap, then we need to agree to much higher money than just $2.5 million. I don't think we should agree to whatever these risks are. If they're completely the seller's fault, then the seller should be paying for them, especially within the statute of limitations. And then finally, one other option, if there was a longer date and a lower money figure, then a higher cap cannot be the holdback. The holdback cannot be the cap for indemnifications. So basically, the seller wants the holdback to be the sole indemnity, and we want the holdback and indemnification provisions pretty much split. So I think what our best position would be I'm okay with agreeing to a lower figure, to agreeing to $2.5 million, and I'm even okay to agree with an 18-month release date. I think 36 months was pretty aggressive ask on our part. I think 18 months is fair, but I don't think that we should agree to 18 months also as the reps and warranties survival period for indemnification, and I don't think that we should agree to $2.5 million as a cap for as the sole source of indemnity funds. So the arguments on why it shouldn't be capped, it's because really it's anything that we're getting indemnified against, it's the seller's fault. You know, anything that's our fault, we won't be getting paid by the seller anyway. So the seller is really taking on their own risk. It's things that they are in the power to control the amount that that the indemnities are paid. So even if there's a cap, it's their fault. So it's really just not fair from the buyer's point of view. And well, I know fairness isn't the strongest argument. It's just our buyer does not want to take on your risk only up to, you know, anything above $2.5 million. $2.5 million is really not so high if you can think of things that can go wrong with a gas station and auto repair and all the kind of liabilities that can be attached to there. There's definitely a lot of workers' compensation issues and death and injuries that are possible there, and those numbers can really add up to be much more than $2.5 million. So I don't think it's right to have a cap. It's not financially realistic to cap indemnities at 2.5, even if 2.5 is deemed a reasonable holdback amount, at least just for the holdback period as a cushion for indemnities. The seller wants a cap on the indemnities and to have the holdback as the sole release because they are giving up a lot by giving up money. They agree to a purchase price of $75 million. They want their $75 million and they want to walk away with that and use it for things. So the longer that they're giving up that money is the longer that they are losing money. So they want to have the holdback to be as low as possible because that'll be as cheap as possible for them and to get them the better money. But they also think that the holdback is very tied together to the indemnities, and that's just not. It's too tied together for what we think is fair. I think the holdback is treated as a kind of cushion against initial indemnities and initial issues that might come up, initial liabilities. But if there are things that have been undiscovered and that are really too great to be covered by the holdback, then the buyer should be indemnified against that still. The seller wants the buyer to buy the risk. You know, when we're buying, we're taking the holdback because we're making our own assessment of the risk. So we don't, if we're agreeing to a 2.5 or even a $5 million holdback, then that's the amount of risk that we are probably foreseeing happening, and anything above that is kind of on us not to predict perhaps, and maybe we're just kind of buying the risk that comes with the company. But I think from the buyer's perspective, our argument against that, it's actually the seller who kind of knows what the risks are. The seller is in the best position to kind of determine, actually really they're in the best position to determine what the holdback should actually be. You know, the buyer knows what risk tolerance we have, but the seller knows what the risks actually are and what kind of liabilities they might be exposed to. So if they do really great disclosures and let us know everything, then they really don't have that much risk to face. So it's on them to just do really great disclosures as the seller and then not have to worry about any kind of indemnities that would go over $2.5 million anyway. If they don't do as good disclosures and indemnity goes above $2.5 million, would have to go above $2.5 million, that really is also their fault, not just for causing the liability, but for not kind of disclosing the potential for that liability and representing against it. Otherwise, we would adjust our holdback and maybe agree to these things, but we don't have that information. The seller is in control of the information. The seller should be the one to bear the risk as high as it goes, not us, even if we're buying them. That said, we also have the time period argument. So eventually we kind of are buying the company's risks and the things that come up with that down the road. But if the holdback does end up being the sole source, then it needs to be much higher and it needs to be much longer of a time period, because this statute of limitations on many of the liabilities that could come up is much longer than the 12 months that the seller has. So we started at 36 months. I think it's okay to say 8 months for just the holdback, but the indemnities in general should still last 24 to even, we could go down to, I think still we want to have 36 months to go with the statute of limitations on many claims that kind of end up 3 years from closing. Because again, those are all due to the seller's faults. They're not ours. The seller is the one who knows those risks. We can't know those risks. So even if we only hold back money for 18 months or 12 months, we still need to be indemnified for 36 months. The seller again is going to argue for that time period. They want the holdback to be as short as possible because that's real cash in their hands, and they agreed to a $75 million purchase price, and they're really conceding by allowing a holdback that we're not going to pay them $75 million on the day we agreed to. And you know, even more than 12 months is a really long time to give up on $2.5 or $5 million. But again, it's kind of part of the indemnifications that we can agree to a lower holdback amount for a shorter period of time if we have a longer period of time and a higher cap or no cap on the indemnities. So just to kind of summarize, because I know I went through a lot of issues there, what I think the buyer's position should be is I think I'm okay with agreeing to $2.5 million as the holdback amount. I would agree even as low as 18 months, because I think 12 months is a bit too short to allow things to actually kind of be litigated and to come up, and things could come up 6 months from now that we wouldn't really know the indemnification amount for another 6 months or so. And I think that it's just better for the holdback period to kind of address the uncertainty about when things could come up. So a lower figure, but for still 18 months is I think a fair deal for both sides. So $2.5 million for 18 months as a holdback. That would be the release date, would be 18 months after closing is when the escrow account would disperse. But there still should not be a cap of $2.5 million on indemnities. I think we need to separate the indemnities and the survival from the holdback. So the holdback, if it's 2.5 for 18 months, the indemnities, we still want survival to be longer than 18 months, preferably as close to 36 months as possible, maybe 24 months. If there's a cap, maybe we'd agree to that a shorter time. If there's no cap, or sorry, if there's a cap, maybe we'd go with for a longer time. If there's no cap, then maybe we'd agree to a shorter time. But I think the cap should be, if they feel strongly that there should be a cap on indemnities, then perhaps we can go to a $5 million cap, but it should not be a number that is tied to the holdout, to the holdback. The holdback should absolutely in no case be the sole source of compensation for an indemnity obligation, even if it's during the holdback period. Like even if in the first 6 months we end up with an indemnity of $5 million, we need to get all $5 million back. Maybe after the holdback there can be another cap, but again, there should not be a cap that is attached to the holdback amount. And there should not be necessarily a time period that is held back to the holdback, that is held to the holdback amount release date, unless that time period for the release date is also longer. And I don't think that the seller would want to have a longer release date, so I think they should agree to have a much shorter release date, but still a long rep and warranty survival date.